Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Human and Wildlife Show.
Yes, hi everyone from Vancouver this time. So this is Christian and Georgia, and we have a very exciting topic today. Georgia, what is it about?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Christian. So today we're going to be talking about our title, I guess, is Wildlife Habitat in Pieces with carnivore ecologist Rumaan Malhotra, who's our guest. And when we talk about like wildlife habitat in pieces, what we're talking about is what happens when you have like this really nice chunk of wildlife habitat and it gets broken up. Like maybe you have, instead of a big forest, you have some forest and some houses. And we call that habitat fragmentation. Um,
That's a,
so
that's an interesting word. Uh, is it really then wildlife in pieces? What does it mean, Georgia?
yeah, so I'm just gonna pop up the term up is up there, habitat fragmentation. And I'm curious if everyone in the chat has heard of habitat fragmentation or if they have a guess as to what it might be. So if you have an idea of what this is, go ahead and put it in the chat. And I'm actually going to read an excerpt from a book that I really like that has a really good metaphor for habitat fragmentation. So this book is called Song of the Dodo. It's by David Quammen. I'm actually not sure how to pronounce his name. But it starts with this really nice metaphor about what habitat fragmentation is. So I'm going to go ahead and put that up as well. Okay, so here we go from the book. So let's start indoors. Let's start by imagining a fine Persian carpet. The carpet is 12 feet by 18. That gives us 216 square feet of continuous woven material. We set about cutting the carpet into 36 equal pieces, each one a rectangle 2 feet by 3. The severing fibers release small tweaky noises, like the muted yelps of outraged Persian weavers. Never mind the weavers. When we're finished cutting, we measure the individual pieces, total them up, and find that, lo, there's still nearly 216 square feet of recognizably carpet-like stuff. But what does it amount to? Have we got 36 nice Persian throw rugs? No. All we're left with is 3 dozen ragged fragments, each one worthless and commencing to come apart. Now take that same logic outdoors. An ecosystem is a tapestry of species and relationships. Chop away a section, isolate that section, and there arises the problem of unraveling. So that again was a quote from the book Song of the Dodo by David Quammen. And it's a metaphor for where it's comparing Persian carpets and habitat fragmentation. So Christian, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's good. I'm just reading some of the comments, and let me just read some of them out. Pablo, hi, and good to see you here. He says, a decay of ecosystem is what I remember from school. Well, you've paid attention in school. You're good. That's great. And Susan North says, deforestation and natural disasters. And then let's see, T.A. Green, nice to see you here. Shared habitat with humans, yes. And then Klingon Warbird says maybe where animals' habitat is taken by human activities and buildings. I think those elements are all correct. What do you think, Georgia?
Yeah, I agree. So everyone has hit on different components of habitat
Mhm.
fragmentation. And so to talk more about this concept, we're going to bring on our special guest, Rumaan Malhotra. And Rumaan is he is a carnivore biologist at University of Michigan, and he studies habitat fragmentation, and he studied it in not only many different geographic areas, so here in Michigan in the United States, but also all the way down in the southern hemisphere in Chile. He's also studied habitat fragmentation there. And on top of that, when he's tired from running around out in the field, he studies habitat fragmentation on his computer with little simulations. So without further ado, Rumaan, welcome to the show.
Thank you guys for having me on here. I'm excited to chat with you guys about this. It's a topic that I think a lot about, and I'm pretty excited about. Um, I just wanted to mention George and Christian. So first of all, thank you. I was looking at the comments as well when you guys polled people on what do you think fragmentation is, and it kind of all these answers are correct to some degree, and this kind of highlights that it's a pretty complicated subject, and there's actually a lot of disagreement as to what constitutes fragmentation, or specifically what its effects are. So it's a complex subject.
Yeah, so I'm curious, maybe we could touch very briefly on the excerpt from the book I read, what parts of it you agree with or maybe don't agree with so much. We can touch on it maybe now and then come back to it if we have time at the end. But I mean, some of the statements were pretty strong. I believe worthless pieces of carpet were mentioned. Do you agree with everything, or what's your take?
So there's a faction of researchers or scientists who would agree with that, and there's a faction who would disagree with that. I think there's something of a middle ground, and part of that has to do with really how you define it. And the idea is this carpet idea works really well. Something I noticed on the cover of that book when you held it up was that it talks about island biogeography. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so this is this idea, which I'll explain in a second, that fragmentation is really pulled from these older ideas, and we think about kind of islands in the ocean, right? And what that means. And there are some ways that that analogy works, and there's some ways that it doesn't. And that's kind of what's led to this split in how we think about fragmentation, why it can be maybe a bad thing or not such a bad thing, or in some cases, it can even be, some people would say it would increase biodiversity in some areas. So that's part of what leads to that split.
Yeah, so to back up, maybe you brought in island biogeography, and historically, and maybe Christian, you can help us suss out the connection a little bit more here too. But like, people have often used islands as kind of a proxy for tiny little patches of habitat, because instead of a little piece of forest in the middle of, say, a cornfield or a suburban neighborhood, you have a little piece of forest or what have you in the middle of an ocean. And so islands are sometimes used as like a really extreme example of like a way to study like tiny pieces of habitat and what happens when you have like one big island versus like two big islands next to each other versus like five very tiny islands all far apart from each other. Like, how much commuting is there of animals between the islands, and things like that, and how much do the different like communities of species differ on the islands? And yeah, there are all kinds of questions people ask.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, islands are very interesting for several reasons. I was on a ornithology conference a few years ago, and just listening to the studies they did on islands, and it's amazing. Whether it is the introduction of rats or cats or whatever on an island, how that all changes to drastically. But Rumaan, I'm just curious, how did you even get interested in this topic?
It's a good question. I think most biologists would agree. Christian, I mean, well, actually, even outside of biologists, I think most people would agree. If you're going out to recreate or to do research or something, most of us would kind of prefer to be in these pristine areas, right? These beautiful forests where, it's great bird watching. There's a lot of plant life. And so I didn't really envision myself working in these systems, which are the opposite in many ways. And part of that is the idea that to some degree, you can't quite get away from it. Human influence is expanding in the world. And so something like fragmentation, even if you consider, you think about places like the Amazon, but globally, 70% of forests are within 1 kilometer of some sort of an edge, right? Something that is not a forest. And then 20% are within 100 meters of an edge. So to some degree, you can't quite get away from it. The other piece of it is even these really pristine areas, they're increasingly they're in isolation. So you have like a national park or something, and then what you have to consider is that park is surrounded by stuff that is not habitat, that's not a forest or something like that. And so when you think about animals, especially in terms of their gene flow. When you get it, there's a lot of things where you have to consider the larger landscape. So you have to look outside those little patches and say, okay, how do they get from one patch, one piece of forest to the other piece of forest? What is in between there? So that's kind of where it came from, was the idea that even if you are really interested in those really intact pieces, you kind of have to take a broader view. So you have to look at what's surrounding them as well, what we call the matrix outside of the actual habitat. That's how I ended up working on that aspect of it.
And then I'm just curious. Your studies took you to Chile, which for me, actually, I'm not going to deviate here, so don't worry. But from an astronomy perspective, Chile is the best place in the earth to watch the sky because of the desert. And so, of course, I'm thinking of desert conditions and very stable conditions. Is that true? Is that why you went there? I'm just curious.
So Chile is there's a couple of reasons I picked it. I will say Chile encompasses this huge range of latitudes. It goes from way up in the Atacama all the way down to basically subantarctic, right? And so the reason I picked it is because Chile actually has a pretty good range of. You have these two big mountain ranges. You have the Andes, and then you have the coastal range, and in between them you have the Central Valley. And in that valley, especially depending on where you are in the country, there are good examples of where the landscape has faced a relatively recent event in terms of it's been breaking up over the past 100 years or so. And part of that has to do with that terrain's easier. So in the region where I work in Los Lagos, it's about a 100-year history of where this area has started to, it used to be contiguous forest, and it started to break up. The other reason why I picked that area was because of the prevalence of domestic dogs in that area, which is something I'll talk about again. Is when we talk about this carpet example, or even with island biogeography, what they're discounting is they're just talking about the habitat. They're not really considering what is in between them. So what is between those patches of carpet? What is between the islands? Because in those cases, they consider it as they're completely separated. There's no way you can get between them, or it's very hard to, which is fair in those cases, right? With islands, usually salt water is a pretty strong barrier. However, what we find is that actually what's between there matters a whole lot, because it matters regarding what things how permeable they are to animals. But what the other piece of it is that what might be a barrier for some species that are normally there, it might be kind of a highway for other things, for invasive species like dogs. So Chile is a really good place to look at those two, both of those things, both fragmentation and domestic dogs, because they both exist in an area that's relatively easy to study.
So Rumaan, just so that we can kind of imagine a visual of where you work. So like this picture I have up now, is that an example of what you would call like habitat in Chile, or is that like between habitat, like some like part of the fragmentation part?
So this, this is super important that we consider what species we're talking about. So what's habitat for one species might not be habitat for another species. So, or it might be something between.
Can I reword it? Is this a
sure.
is this a place that we're looking at right now that is like this because of human influence,
Uh-huh.
or is this part of the natural state of the area in Chile?
Okay, so this is a human influenced area. So this is a pasture. So this is a pasture for sheep, and what you're seeing there is a southern gray fox, a chia fox that is in that landscape. And that's a species that actually does quite well, even in these human modified areas. And actually, I believe that there's another picture, the same picture, but zoomed out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind bringing that up?
Yeah. Here it is.
So this also highlights so this you might imagine is a pasture in between two fields, right? Or between, two patches of forest or something like that. That would be considered matrix or a barrier between the forests. However, if you look in the background, there's also a fence. So that can actually be, there are different sorts of barriers that might break up habitat, and some might be more or less permeable. So for example, a field might not be the biggest barrier to something like a fox, But a fence, which might not take up nearly much area, might be a much more serious barrier for something, especially since, for example, a lot of the fences in this area are barbed wire and they're electric fences too. So it makes it a little harder for wildlife to get through.
Yeah, so this is like a really good example of, we kind of saw a big diversity in the comments from people in the beginning when we asked what you think habitat fragmentation is. People talked about buildings and different types of things. Yeah, the answer is all kinds of things can fragment habitat. Fences, like agricultural land, suburbs, buildings, roads, and what counts as a fragmenting force differs depending on the species. So this, what type of fox did you say this was again in the picture?
It is a southern gray fox. Locally, it's called a chia fox.
Mhm.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
And they do kind of well with different habitat types, it sounds like. Yeah.
They do. There's this whole interplay with, so chia foxes are actually pretty similar to, we have a gray fox that is up here in North America as well. And it's the thing is, a lot of these species, they don't exist in isolation, right? So there's other foxes in the landscape. So there's a larger fox in this. So where we have coyotes in the northern hemisphere, down in the southern hemisphere, they have colpeo foxes, which are larger than chia foxes. Now, there's definitely elements which we haven't fully figured out, but we can talk about, or based on what we know about the animals, we can think about where something like a colpeo, a larger fox, it doesn't do as well. It might need more intact habitat. Now, normally colpeos and chias don't get along so well. And where you have two things that don't get along, usually the bigger one wins. And so when you have habitats that open up more, suddenly there's this shift to it's more friendly to the smaller fox, which would normally be at a competitive disadvantage because of its size. Now this habitat is an area that the smaller fox will be able to use better than this larger fox, which would normally exclude it. So there's all these different dynamics going on that kind of go hand in hand with the actual landscape that's changing as well.
Yeah, and we have a really sort of, well, first of all, just to clarify, it looks like, so to your to one side of you we have like the field, like the more human influenced habitat, and the other side, that's like an example of a forest in Chile, correct? A sort of less human altered habitat area.
Yes. So actually, that forest is it's native forest, but it's only like 50 meters away from a edge of like a pasture field. Some of these little patches are actually quite dense, and so even though you wouldn't know it just looking at that picture on the right side with the forest, but it's actually in a human dominated system. It's just there are these little patches of forest that exist throughout that can actually hold quite a lot of these native species that are still around.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have a
James,
really,
yeah,
I was just gonna bring up James's question. Yeah, he brings up a really good question. Like, always curious with the differences between wild dogs and wolves. Are both of these species in South America, and do they share territory? And so, I mean, I guess first of all, to preface that question, Rumaan, this is kind of the group of animals that you focus on, correct?
Yes.
In your research, which is.
So canids are kind of the dog group, and so that includes foxes and wolves and domestic dogs. So domestic dogs it's a domesticated wolf, essentially. So wolves are Canis lupus, and so domestic dogs are Canis lupus familiaris. It's like a highly derived wolf, so to speak. So wild dogs is actually that itself is it could mean a lot of different things. So true wild dogs, what we would refer to as a separate species altogether that is not related to, or not very closely related to, wolves or to domestic dogs, and they're mostly found in Africa. When we think about wild or maybe feral dogs, they are, just as a heads up, wolves are not present in South America. But they are found in North America and throughout Europe, and so what constitutes kind of a feral dog is also, again, a really broad thing. And it's the more in probably the past decade, we've been thinking more about how to actually separate them out. So there's dogs that you'd consider feral, which are kind of, you see them out when you're out and about, and if they're truly feral, they're living off of wild prey, right? They're dogs, packs of dogs, and these do exist. But probably the strongest examples of truly feral dogs are like Papuan singing dogs and dholes in India, and dingoes in Australia. But normally, most of the dogs we see in a lot of areas, like in Chile, they're what we would call free-ranging dogs. So a lot of people would consider them feral, but what that means is even these dogs that are kind of wandering around in the woods somewhere, they are fed by somebody. They might come back to somebody's house. They're just not contained. So they'll maybe get some food and then they'll wander back out again. And then it's kind of a gradient that goes all the way from truly a domestic, like an animal that is owned by somebody, and a pet that goes all the way to feral dogs based on how much human subsidies they get. So how often they'll get garbage, and they're able to eat garbage, whether they're fed by somebody, how much they're living off of people's livestock. So dogs will also go and kill people's livestock and eat them. So it's a spectrum, so to speak.
Yeah,
Yes.
Rumaan, that's quite interesting. I was just wondering a bit about the word fragmentation, because you're bringing these dog-like animals or dog-related animals. So when I think of fragmentation, and you talking about fences, I can understand that. But in actual respect, probably if a fence is only one type of fragmentation, it doesn't even have to be one, because usually where the fences, they're neighborhoods, and that's good for, as you said, for coyotes, for all kinds of dog related wildlife and so on. So that would actually expand their habitat, or am I seeing this wrong?
Yes. So you're absolutely right. So this kind of expansion or fragmentation, one of the things I was looking at was, well, what does it mean for dogs, right? So what this means is it expands their influence on the landscape, because suddenly things do have preferences as to where they like to hunt, where they like to roam. And so for dogs, they tend to, we found that, or this isn't just me, this is in general, the research has found that they prefer more open areas, right? So they like areas which are less dense and less forested. And so as you have fragmentation, what happens is it makes it easier for them to actually get into these landscapes. And so their influence on wildlife can increase. So when some of the work that I'd done had to do with, I measured different habitat variables, like how does fragmentation, how does this affect native carnivores, and then how does this affect dogs? And what I found was basically for some things like the chia fox, the habitat didn't matter so much, right? They can, whether it was fragmented or not, they were still around. But as you lost habitat, you had more dog presence. And now that has a negative effect on some species, because dogs will harass and kill foxes, and there's concerns for disease, because they kind of host several diseases that would normally get wiped out in natural populations. So things like canine distemper and rabies. So they kind of work in I don't want to say they work together, but it's definitely facilitated. Dogs are facilitated by, as landscapes break up, it becomes a lot easier for dogs to get in there. Sorry, did I answer your question?
Yeah. Yes, very well, very well. Georgia, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think this is a really good time, Rumaan. I mean, you told us some of like what you're looking at, but like sort of what are your specific research questions? Or maybe we can just start with one, like what is one question you looked at in Chile? Because there's so many, I mean, your research is like really cool, really complex, and there's so many different questions you can start asking, right? Because there's different levels of like deforestation happening, there's fences, there's dogs, and like there's different native species, and so there's all these factors that are varying in the system. And just so I guess to give the audience a quick idea of how you collect this data, a lot of this data you collect with remote camera traps, correct? So like you're looking at all these photographs of like what animals are around, and you know like where you put the camera, what type of habitat it was in, and what was nearby. So like, yeah, like what's a question you asked and an answer you got?
The broad question, sorry if it's a little redundant, but the broad question that I went into the Chilean system with was that is the occupancy is, if you think about the landscape and you break it up into a bunch of little grid cells, how many of those grid cells is a particular species in? So I was looking at, is the occupancy of native carnivores, so these 2 fox species and 1 little cat species, is it influenced by habitat fragmentation and destruction, or domestic dogs, or both? And kind of a sub-question of that was, is the influence of dogs mediated by the landscape? That is the effect of dogs dependent on the landscape itself? And what I found was, yeah, go ahead.
Let me see if I make sure I understand the question first. So you wanted to know, like, okay, let's pretend you mentioned like all the little grids for occupancy. Let's imagine like there's a bunch of little empty apartments that, I don't know, let's say species of interest A could live in. Like what proportion of the like apartments are they taking up? Is it more affected by like the deforestation, or is it more affected by there being dogs around? But then also, like, how related are like presence of dogs and deforestation? Like maybe dogs really don't like going into the forest or something like that, and then they're both kind of like deforestation and presence of dogs end up kind of being the same thing, where you can't really differentiate. Okay. And so, yeah, that's really cool. What did you find?
So what I found was, what I found was essentially that, yes, dogs increase their presence in the landscape with increasing deforestation. So the less forest you have, the more likely you are to have a dog in an area. And then the second piece of it was that one of the species showed that as the landscape changed, it did not change the occupancy. However, as you increase dogs, you are less likely to see that species. So I realize it's a little tricky, because you're saying, okay, if dogs are increasing and dogs are dependent on the landscape, why doesn't the landscape matter for that species? And so you can kind of disentangle them to some degree. And what this gets into is a little bit of a methods question, which is a little tricky, and it has to do with when you place a camera, you have to account for the fact that whether or not something is living in that grid cell, you may or may not actually see it on the camera, right? It has to do with we call it detection. So what is the probability that if you have a camera in this grid cell that you're not going to see that animal, and why is that? And so it is kind of a complex modeling question that goes into these things we use called occupancy models. But essentially, landscape didn't have that much of an effect on these native species, but dogs did. But dogs are kind of a function of the landscape. And there's another piece of it which may be important, which is something I'm still working on that I haven't done, which is that when you have the landscape is changing, especially quickly, often there can be a time lag. So even if you say, okay, this is where the species is today, right? It exists in these 5 grid cells. Well, that might not be dependent on what the landscape looks like today. It might be dependent on what the landscape looked like 5 years ago. They might kind of be lingering where there used to be habitat. And so there's these lagged effects. And so unless you look at a time series, unless you look at, and we can do that now, right? You can access satellite data that goes back decades and see, okay, what did the landscape look like several years ago? And is that a better way of describing where these things are today? So that is something I'm working on. So that might be part of what's going on here.
Rumaan, I have a question about because more from a scientific point of view, it's exactly what you picked up with satellite images and so on, which probably are fairly unbiased because they're taken all over, and data sampling that you can do with a camera, which can, whether you like it or not, be quite biased because you are going to put cameras in certain areas where it's easy for you to access and so on. And that's, I think, a trap we all fall into. I'm not accusing you of anything, but I'm just saying that's very dangerous. That that we collect subjective data. What is your comment on that?
So part of it is, again, everything comes into study design. And there's, there's of course there's, I feel like, some sort of middle ground between an optimal study design and what's logistically feasible, and coming up with something that's sort of in between. And so part of what it was using an ideal thing that we do would be a stratified random design. So we'd say, if you throw a grid on the landscape, then you want your sampling to be proportionate to how much of that each landscape type there is. So if there's 40% of it is forest, you want 40% of your cameras to be in forest, right? And so that was part of it, but the other piece of it is depending on how you tailor your question as well. So in my case, I was specifically interested in, well, what is going on with these little fragments of these little forest fragments that are in between these fields, right? Mm-hmm. And so basically I selected for those specific little fragments, and then I measured various metrics as distance to nearest water, distance to edge. So you can kind of pull some of those metrics to tackle some of the biases that you face. What is particularly important with cameras is to make sure that they're far enough apart. And that, again, is relative to the animal, right? So one of the big issues that you can have is that if a particular animal is, if the cameras are not so far apart and it's within what we call a home range, how much that kind of the space that one animal would use, if it's showing up in multiple cameras, now that's affecting your inferences. You're kind of expecting to be independent, so you have to make sure that your spacing is such that it's relative to what animal you're trying to capture. So for example, we have pumas on our cameras, but the inferences I can make for them are different because I have probably all of my cameras are within the home range of a single puma, because they can roam these massive distances. So actually, there's a picture I have of some of the sampling I did. Can you see that map on there? Now, here's one of the tricky things, Christian, is that part of it was in this landscape, because this is all privately owned land, was that it was based on who I could get permission from.
Of course, I so understand it. It must be difficult. Of course.
Yeah. And so, just to sort of zoom out for a moment, like this question of putting cameras in biased locations that are easier to get to, this is not a problem unique to camera trap studies. This is a problem that has happened for a long time in biology. So going back to sort of like, early expeditions to the Amazon or whatever, people were going along the Amazon River, and just like, because it's easy to take a boat down there, and then it's like, oh, like what animals or plants can you collect from the Amazon River? So if anything, we're becoming like more and more aware of this problem and sort of how to account for it. And Rumaan talked about like some different ways to account for it. But even now people are like driving along the road, and it's like, oh, what plants, what cool plants can I collect from the road? So Rumaan, is this the picture you were talking about?
It is. So there's a couple things going on. So that's kind of what that's a satellite view of the landscape, and you can kind of see that those there's two things going on. There's this kind of brighter green patches. So what I've done is a lot of that landscape is pasture lands, and those, if you look on the left side, those darker green patches are native forest that's left in some areas. In the middle, I have essentially highlighted those. So I basically made polygons around where those are. And the white dots are cameras. Because it's kind of zoomed out, it's hard to see the spacing, but there's 500 meters in between each of those. Now, I wanted to use this to show you guys what's particularly tricky about trying to define what is habitat and what is matrix, what is in between. So if you look at that big patch of dark green on the top right side, at a first glance, you'd kind of think that, oh, that's forest, that looks like good habitat. However, that big patch there is actually all exotic plantations. So that stuff's all like pine plantations, eucalyptus plantations, which are different than the native forest that is normally in that region. Why that's tricky is then you have to make decisions as to, okay, so for the species I'm interested in, is that difference, first, can I distinguish between the two? And second, is that a barrier to them, right? It doesn't matter that it's a different kind of forest altogether. Is it as important as, say, pastures versus native forests? So this is, again, some of the tricky things you have to deal with when you're trying to define fragmentation in the landscape or habitat loss. Those big gaps that you see in between my cluster, 3 main clusters, those are areas that I could not get any permission to place cameras. So it's to give you an idea, you have this, initially when you're designing this project, you have this ideal design, and then you get to the field, and then suddenly you run into things like permission. This is, again, why working in forest reserves and stuff, you often can get better coverage, right? Because if you get permission, you can get permission to the entire protected area. When you're working in private lands, which are increasingly big, we're kind of realizing that they are pretty important for conservation. That's what exists between those protected areas. But trying to figure out how to do research there is a little bit more tricky and requires a little bit of creativity because we're not used to doing research in those spaces.
Yeah, so the problems with getting landowner permission, and as you stated before, especially like in previous conversations we've had, that people are not necessarily the most receptive to some stranger who doesn't, or, who clearly isn't a native Spanish speaker, perhaps, just kind of marching up with their like clipboard and stuff. So perhaps. Well, perhaps you could tell us, this is a good segue into why some of your research does not take place in in actual nature, correct?
I was just thinking the same thing, Georgia. So one of the ways we can check whether what we're seeing in the ground is representative of what we would expect from theory, or in general, this is true for working in these spaces, but also with carnivores, which are particularly hard to get data for because they're quite rare, right? You struggle to get enough pictures of them to have power in your statistical analyses. And so one thing we can do is we have all these tools where we can simulate things these days, right? And so one of the I can share my screen and show you this little simulation thing I have going at the moment.
Go ahead and share. Let me get me and Christian out of here so there's more room.
James, just to answer your question, one of the wildcats so both the foxes I study are on both sides of the Andes, as are pumas, but one of the small wildcats called a huina, or a codcod, they are only found on the Chilean side. And there's another cat called a colo, which, if you look at the range of the huina, it kind of runs just in Chile on one side of the Andes, and when you get far enough south, it's kind of, and the other side of the Andes is all the other cat. So that is one that is endemic and unique just to Chile.
Rumaan, I have to tell you, I feel a little bit cheated that you didn't upload more camera trap pictures. I want to see these little cats. They all sound so cute.
I do have a picture of one that's melanistic too. That's black and has a rat in its mouth. Okay.
All right, fill up the simulation, and then maybe you can post some pictures later.
They're really cute. They're smaller than house cats, and they have these really fat, fluffy tails. Okay, so you can see my screen now, right?
We actually cannot.
No.
Oh, here, I believe here it is. Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
There it is. Yeah.
So, for example, yeah, go ahead.
Wait, let's actually, before we show that picture, let's show, just so they can see, because we have this screenshot here that's a little bit more zoomed in.
Yes.
So kind of prep people. So this is like what the simulation looks like. It's like so red is like the non-ideal habitat, or like the human influenced areas, and then the green is like the good habitat. And then we have two characters.
Yeah, and I realized that I just spent all this time talking about how you can't break into this binary distinction. It's not just like forest and bad habitat. But for the sake of this simulation, I did simplify it. So sometimes it's easier to start with a very simple model and then try to make it more and more realistic. Yes, and basically what I did was in this, I was looking at movement. And so I programmed it so that there's a sheep up there and a wolf. You can it doesn't have to be a sheep and a wolf. It's just the animals I chose for this. And I
Yeah,
basically
the sheep is
programmed them.
kind of hard to see, but it's like the white dot in the upper like left corner, I think. Yeah. It's a little
Yeah,
hard to
and
see.
so I programmed them to move differently based on whether they're in habitat or if they're in the red, in the bad habitat. They move in a different way. And then I was using that simulation to see what that means for how often they will run into each other. It is a little bit like Pac-Man, Frankman.
Yeah,
But I
just wait till
can,
you see them move around. All right, let's do the simulation. Oh, where did your screen share go? It's gone.
I'd stopped for a second.
Okay. Yeah, so that's what.
Okay, I'm sharing. Okay, so here it is, and I can vary based on this slider how much of the habitat it randomly generates this landscape based on how much. So if I want 31 or like about 30% of it to be fragmented or matrix, I will do this. And if I want it to be more, I can increase it, and it'll basically change it. And so what I can do, so let me set it low first. And I think I've got it pretty slow. And then can you guys see them moving?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so they're basically moving to the landscape. And if I sped it up a bit, you'd see that like this counts how often they actually run into each other. So if I sped it up a whole bunch, there they go.
Woo.
Yep. And then you can see every time they run into each other, it adds to my counter here. So we can use things like this, and then I can do the same thing, but change, for example, I can change this. And now they'll move different. I'm running it too fast for you to see right now, but they move differently in the landscape based on what type of habitat they're running in. So we can kind of use things like tools like this. Now, I just wanted to use this real quick to talk about something which causes part of the big debate on the effects of fragmentation, which is that you can see how some of these are kind of isolated from other areas, right? There's red between this habitat patch and some of these other ones, correct?
Yes. Wait,
Yes.
could you restate the question?
So essentially, you can see how the landscape's kind of breaking apart, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the tricky thing here is that fragmentation, we usually refer to the configuration of the landscape. So basically how separated these are, right? Are they in 2 different pieces? Are they in 4 different pieces? What's tricky is as natural landscapes break up, what is happening is it's really hard to disentangle that from the actual amount of green. So fragmentation refers to the configuration, like kind of the shapes that it's making. But it's really hard to separate that from, okay, we're actually also converting a bunch of these squares into red, right? So the problem here is that a lot of research is, a lot of this debate comes from, okay, are you seeing the effects of the configuration of the landscape, or simply are you seeing it because there's less habitat than there was before? And that is also what's led to this dichotomy we were talking about earlier, where why for some things it seems like the actual configuration may not matter as much. And for other things, it's like, okay, the configuration makes a big difference. And part of that has to do with what is actually between those pieces of landscape, right? How resistant is it to something going through it?
Yeah, when you talk about the configuration, just like the arrangement, there was one screenshot once I saw your computer and it looked like a flag, right? Because it was like a big red cross in the middle,
Oh,
and
yes.
then like 4 green patches. So yeah, you can change like kind of the size and distribution of the patches.
Yeah, Rumaan, I have an interesting question for you because
Sure.
it's more to do with sudden nonlinear effect. So what I mean is, if you change, like you're doing that in your model, or maybe you've observed that too, let's say when a fragmentation goes beyond a certain point, you see a drastic change. It's not linear anymore. You would see a complete breakdown, maybe of the habitat of one species, and a completely flip over. Is there anything, did you ever come across anything like that?
So there are examples of it in the literature. In my system, no, I have not. That's certainly possible, but once again, what's tricky, Christian, is if we're talking about some level of fragmentation, so how broken up the landscape is, or if there's a critical threshold of how much habitat you fall below. So if there's suddenly, it's to the point, and in natural system is really difficult to figure out because they're usually happening together, right? So it's quite a difficult thing to test, but you certainly could parameterize a model to try to figure that out. You could say, okay, this is what we've seen. Now what happens if we do the same thing, but we change just the amount at the same time? We keep it as like one connected block, but we reduce the size of it versus how it's actually laid out.
And another thing that really interests me a lot, I mean, we haven't talked about raccoons yet, but raccoons do very well in cities. So sorry if I make a jump suddenly, but maybe you have a comment, maybe you don't. I just find them fascinating, how well they adopt. And I heard a program once on the radio when I was driving, and that was a wildlife biologist, a woman who was specializing in studying, wildlife in cities. And she made an interesting comment and said that it seems that a lot of wildlife is adapting much better than we are actually thinking they would adapt. So what it means is they are actually changing the environment for us and not vice versa. They're adapting to such a good extent. They're the ones who are tricking us and not we them, So, and raccoons seem to be an example. I don't know. I'm just throwing this in. I found that very interesting. So.
It's definitely true. Some species, there are many species which are doing quite well in this sort of new world, or this changing world where you have a lot more built habitat. You have more agricultural fields. Some things do really well in them. So again, coyotes are another example of a species that has done remarkably well. So that isn't to say, as the landscape change, that there's no hope, right? Because there is. Some things are more resilient or more plastic than we give them credit for. And I guess the key is sort of determining what we can do to have a world that's basically kind of friendly to both those species, which are more and less resistant to some of those changes, and also how to preserve some of the aspects of what we have that can continue to make them basically friendly for some of the species that are doing well, things like raccoons or for example, the chia foxes in southern Chile that are quite that seem to be doing quite well in some of those landscapes. So and that is to also emphasize. Go ahead, Georgia.
Oh, I was just going to say, because you were mentioning the time lag before, like it's hard to tell what the negative impacts on wildlife are because it takes some time for the impact to happen to them. But also there's a time lag for species that do well sometimes, right? So like at first, for example, cougars used to be very scared of domestic dogs and avoid urban areas, but they are learning there's a time lag, and now they're actually like, and coyotes too, like now they're like, wait a second, the cities aren't so scary, these dogs aren't really that tough, and they're kind of moving in. So the time lag works both ways.
Yeah, they're starting to figure out that those dogs are actually quite a good food source. Yes, you're right. The time lag does kind of go both ways. It is going to be interesting, and some of these effects are really hard to tell unless you do study them for quite a while, or you have a decent time series. If you come back to the same place over and over and over again, there are actually a few sites where, like the Metatron comes to mind in France, where people are setting up these kind of large scale experiments to try to figure out some of these effects in kind of a more controlled setting. But in some places, it's going to kind of play out as we have time, so to speak, or as time goes by.
You mean the Mediterranean is a more controlled setting because the climate is kind of more consistent, or?
Sorry, not the Mediterranean. It's the Metatron. It's like a large scale ecological experiment at like the landscape scale where they.
Okay. So it's just land that they've set aside, and they've been like, this land is for figuring out long-term science habitat things, and we're not going to do non-science messing with the habitat. Okay.
Yes.
James has a good question he just threw in here. I know it's intrusive, but would tagging a sample of species have helped research?
So essentially, oh man, I would love to do some, put some GPS collage on things. So movement ecology in general is kind of this growing field, and we can do a lot of interesting things, especially at a finer scale when you can see where things are moving around. That is something I would like to do in that landscape. There are people doing it in other places. I will say part of it is funding limited because those collars are quite expensive. But absolutely, again, it depends on what questions you want to answer. But I do think that is kind of moving forward is kind of the future in terms of really for some really fine scale responses. Like, okay, what are the specific things that our dogs are reacting to? What are these native species reacting to? Collar data is absolutely the way to go. However, there's a trade-off. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, to build on that, like what you could with the collar data, like you're saying, more fine scale data on the movement, but like you wouldn't be able to, for example, look at as many species. So you're able to look at like whatever species happens to wander in front of your camera, you have information on it. Whereas taking it would be hard to like catch all these different species and put tagging on them. It's certainly useful to do, but it depends on your question, like Rumaan is saying, and you might miss out on, like, for example, I know, Rumaan, you found that like in some types of habitat, like species, it's not necessarily about occupancy, like what's around or not, but like sometimes species shift like what time of day they're active.
Absolutely.
Based on the habitat type and stuff like that. And so
exactly, but it would also help you answer the question of bias that we had earlier, right? So we would see their behavior much better, and then we would say, oh my goodness, if I placed my camera there, so I would have a different result, So I think everything's important, So
yeah, exactly. And yeah, Rumaan was getting at that, I believe, with his trade-offs that he was mentioning. And we benefit too from other previous tagging studies. Like we know something about maybe how these species tend to move and stuff like that, which can help us inform where to put our cameras. And and then it's sort of an iterative process where different types of studies contribute different types of information and inform future studies of all related types.
Yeah, Rumaan, one thing I'd like to ask you too is what about the group behavior, which is quite important. I mean, sometimes I've seen coyotes, for example, alone, but I've seen also in groups, and that seems to change. How does that? What is your comment there regarding fragmentation and their behavior?
So that's a great question. I'm actually not sure, but I will say for coyote group behavior is actually super interesting because they do often you find them. I don't know how often they exhibit group behavior in natural systems. They might to some degree, but for example, we have cameras in Detroit, and there are coyotes all over. Any major city in the U.S. You probably have coyotes around the city. And in Detroit, we see a lot of group behavior. So that's not something that we've actually tested, but just anecdotally, looking at the camera images in the urban system, I've seen a lot more of the group behavior from them. Right, group behavior is actually huge when it comes to dogs because it lets them. Dogs can harass things that are way bigger than they are. There's this. It's a book that's specifically on. I think it's by David McDonald, but it's this book that's specifically on the effects of dogs. And the cover picture is a polar bear facing off with like 5 dogs, right? And part of this is that dogs are able to harass things that are a lot bigger than them just because of this social structure that they have.
Yeah.
How it is affected by how fragmentation affects that, I'm not sure. That would be an interesting question. If they're more able to, dogs from different areas are able to form packs more easily or something along those lines. I'm not sure.
Okay.
It's I was just thinking about it. There is a lot of, it is kind of ripe for study. So to,
New
so to
topic.
speak.
How's that?
Yeah, it's very easy in biology to ask a question that has not been looked at yet.
Isn't that true? Isn't that true?
Rumaan, since this is the Humans and Wildlife show, and we've talked about dogs quite a bit now, domestic dogs, I'm curious, what are your stories of people from your studies? What do people think when you ask for permission to put up cameras on their land? And what do they think about, or do they know that you're like looking at the impacts of their dogs potentially? And I know you have some conservation follow-up ideas too for how to like communicate with people. I guess, yeah, I'm just asking if you could talk a little bit more about like the human element maybe.
Generally speaking, people have been very open to I'm very upfront about what I'm doing. I don't necessarily say I'm looking at the effects of your dog. I just I'm looking at the effects.
Do you have a dog? I'm gonna figure out what it's up to.
I think that I get this. People are usually very interested to see what's on the camera on their land, and sometimes they're quite surprised to see some of these species that they know are in the area, but they're like, oh, they're on my land. Other people are less happy about it. They're like, that's the fox that's been eating my chickens, and so they're. But I think a lot of folks. I tell them, it kind of very delicately. I'm like, oh, I found these effects of dogs, but I think a lot of folks have this idea that like their dog is the exception, and it's understandable. A lot of people don't really it's totally understandable because people see their dogs and they usually see them sleeping around their land, and they don't realize that some of these dogs will actually wander quite far when they're not paying attention. And when dogs have actually been collared, some of them, and the thing is, it also varies a lot, dog to dog. Some will just stay within like a kilometer of the house. Others will wander like 10 kilometers a day, right? But people don't realize that their dog is doing that. And the thing is, they're often open to the idea because even if they haven't seen their dog doing something, some of them might have had livestock that was killed by someone else's dog, right? By free-ranging dogs that came and killed some of their chickens or killed something else. And so it's generally people have been pretty open to it. And so I try to start those conversations off with a lot of people have dogs to protect their livestock. And so the idea is that, hey, your dog will probably do a lot more good in protecting your livestock if it stays near to livestock as opposed to wandering off. But I was just having a conversation with somebody who works in the Himalayas, and we were talking about how human psychology is such a big part of conservation. So things like dogs are really, really tricky topic because they have these huge impacts, and they're quite same with cats, right? Domestic cats, but it's a really hard topic to make any progress on or to do something about because people are really sensitive about those species, and understandably so. So those are like human psychology is a really critical part of any sort of conservation efforts, and assessing what people's perceptions are and getting to the root of why they feel the way they do is really important, trying to figure out how you can actually design sort of a solution or come to something that's like mutually it's a mutual satisfaction to a practitioner who's trying to preserve some sort of wildlife, and also the landowners who, the people who actually they need to use their land to make their livelihoods. So, and it's as you know, any good solution that's a long-lasting solution has to be a balance of both. You cannot really prioritize one over the other, or you can't really put people's concerns aside because you're just not going to have a solution that works for the community where you're trying to implement it. So,
yeah, I imagine there's a perfectly good line of thinking, which is like, oh yeah, that fox I don't like is on my property. Like, good, I'm glad my dog is out there like messing around with it, because I want that fox to stay away. But
Sure.
as you said, there's also a good argument for like maybe a compromise that's like incentivizing people to try to keep their dogs sort of out of the forest around the livestock, and it's doing a better job of protecting the livestock, as you say. In Michigan, in your camera traps in Michigan, do you see many domestic dogs or cats? I know we often associate it with like a cultural thing that's more common other places to let your animals go free, or your dogs go free at least. No.
Lots of cats, not many dogs. Go ahead, Christian.
I'm just curious of more on the technology. I mean, that you use, are those special type of outdoor cameras that you use, and how does that technology work?
So they are. There's a lot of camera traps out there by different companies. A lot of them are used. People often use them for hunting, right? So companies like Bushnell or Reconics, they make these cameras. Excuse me. They're used for both. They're used for research, or also used for hunting. They're water resistant. So basically, they are triggered within if something runs in front of the camera. Usually within the trigger distances. It varies by camera, but then it'll take a photo, and then the type of camera also varies. So that you have infrared cameras and you have white flash cameras, and if you're using both in combination, you have to take that into account in your models because something like a white flash camera, it's less ideal in many situations because the flash will scare an animal, and that will have an effect on how likely you are to detect the animal again after the first time it goes by. So that's definitely a consideration. So for example, in my work, I use just infrareds because I didn't want to have to deal with that. So,
right. Oh, interesting.
I remember when Rumaan and I used to live together, we were trying to grow corn in the garden, and something was eating the corn, but we didn't know what. So we put out one of the rabbits. I couldn't believe it because like the corn would get like this high, and then it would just be like gone the next day. And I was like, "What is it?" So I took the camera, and it was a rabbit. Didn't realize that they could like eat up so high. But
I was going to say a quick note about that actually. Just to get back at James's earlier question, which we talked about a little bit, but this is again one of the things, James, that about something like a camera trap, which is non-invasive versus a collar, you get different types of data, but then you also have to account for if you trap an animal to collar it, you have to account for like a break-in time because what it's going to do is going to be influenced by the fact that it was captured by a person and you put something on it, right? So you have to account for various things that, but as soon as you do something in the natural world, that it's going to have something of an effect too. So, and that's even true with camera traps.
Its behavior isn't going to necessarily match like what would have happened if you hadn't put the camera on it. So when you're using the cameras, you're being like very sneaky, like a wildlife spy or something that wildlife presumably doesn't know you're there, and so you're getting like a true reflection of what they're up to.
I'm amazed at how often things can actually, even with the infrareds, you can almost not see anything when it takes a picture. There's like a light that's like very slight. But sometimes you'll have things like you'll have a camera and you'll have something just like two eyes are popping up into the frame here. And then it's like nose is there. And it's like clearly interested in the camera itself. So it knows something is up there. But
it's something. You're not being as sneaky as you think you are. It either like maybe hears a noise when the trigger goes off, or it just recognizes something that is a new element in its habitat.
In Michigan all the time. We'll have cameras where suddenly you'll see a patch of fur and you'll just see the field of view is completely changed. You're like, that's a bear. The bear is moving this camera around and is basically, you can tell with different animals. Raccoons are often they're smart. They're really curious. They will find the camera, and then you'll get, like 100 pictures of a raccoon's ear, or then it's like cheek, its faces is kind of like all over the camera.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I should have included some camera trap photos. I'm sorry.
I know. I was going to say, Rumaan, why don't you just? Are they all like in a folder in your computer? Can you screen share with us? We don't mind watching you scroll around for a moment.
I don't know if I have. Maybe I do have some on my desktop. I generally keep them on the lab drive because they take up so much room.
I'm going to throw a question to the audience real quick while you maybe take a second to look. I'm curious to hear, I'm trying to get more feedback at the start and at the end. So I'm curious to hear for people that are still around, like, what is something interesting that you learned or changed your perspective during this broadcast, if anything? I think that, you know, that kind of feedback is going to be really useful for us in continuing to tailor the show for you all.
And whilst you do that, I'll tell you a quick story about cameras,
Yeah.
and you know, whilst
Please.
Something that I found absolutely fascinating, because he was just talking about infrared, you know, the light, and what we found, you know, there are a lot of cameras now, of course, for wildlife everywhere, and they also for eagle nests, right? And what one's been wondering about is I mean, we do know, for example, that the eagles don't see the near red, or what we call infrared. It's not quite correct, but it's near red light of the cameras. So it's similar to the human eye. We just see something that's really dim. Okay, and for owls, it's different, right? Owls have very depending on the type of owl, of course. Some owls are very sensitive at night, and have a much more extended red sensitivity of their eyes. And what one has found is, which is surprising, is that there are quite a few attacks of I think the greyhorn owl in eagle nests at night, especially where there are cameras, it seems. And what I believe is happening here is that the owls are very clearly seeing the illumination of the eagle. So actually, the eagle is a sitting prey there. You know, just
wow,
they're bashing them full. That's what I believe. I have never seen it proof, but I have very strong reason to believe that that is a possibility. So I just wanted to mention that. So
yeah, it's interesting. Rumaan mentioned like the animals checking out the cameras. I haven't ever done research with camera traps, but I have done research with microphones that I've put out that record animal sounds instead of taking pictures of them. And certain species of bat are known for being very curious. There's this new, basically what's to them is like a new tiny skinny tree, because you put the microphone up on a pole and they will fly around and around in it in circles, kind of trying to figure out. And then, yeah, you have like a million recordings of what is normally considered kind of a rare bat species, but it's like, what is this thing? Yeah, it's just a particularly curious.
That's incredible. That's good.
Yeah, I'm going to take us off again, Christian, so that we can...
Yep. Oh, there we go.
What are we looking
at? I just found a few.
Oh, birds.
I'm sorry. There's not that many. So this is a chukao, which is a really, like, this is anytime you move in the forest, if you stop, one of these will start, like, you'll hear it moving through underbrush because they're super curious, and it'll pop up. And I have thousands of pictures of these guys looking at the camera, popping in from different parts of the frame. Very pretty. They're distinctive, and they're endemic as well. They're only found in Chile, I believe. There's another chukao. I fortunately don't have my very best. This is called a zorzal. It's like a kind of like a southern robin.
Ooh. I like its little hood. It seems like
I'll come back to
nighttime that you have these birds out. Oh, a cat.
This is a Winia. You can see its fat little tail there. They're very small, and they kind of have all these stripes on them, and you get melanistic ones. And apart from this, I only have one other one that I was able to find right now, which is a photo from Detroit that I love, which is a squirrel with a smiley lollipop that it has found.
That squirrel's about to have like a sugar craze. It's gonna be running around.
That is great. Goodness me.
Speaking of your Michigan camera trap stuff, a question from James, are there any wolves in Michigan, and have you ever photographed a wolf in Michigan?
Yes. The answer is yes. In the UP, there are definitely wolves. And yes, we have, in the Upper Peninsula, thank you. And we have actually one of the best photos we've gotten from the camera traps. So part of this, as a photographer, one of my frustrations with camera traps is that the image quality is quite low. And I've always dreamed of setting up, actually at my field set in Chile, a DSLR camera trap for like some really nice photos. But one of the better photos we have that I've seen from our camera traps in general is of a wolf in the Upper Peninsula. I don't have that photo on me right now, but
That's totally fine. I've been trying to convince Christian that we need to put up a website for the show, and then we could have a little blog post for each episode where we have additional pictures and links and stuff. And so this is really good
Yes,
motivation for us to get on
it's a good idea. We should.
Yeah. Is that your phone, Rumaan? I see.
Sorry, yes.
No, it's totally fine. So we are reaching time. We're at an hour and 10 minutes now, so kind of time to wrap up. Do you have any final things that you wanted to say, Rumaan?
Just to stress that those little patches of habitat that are left are actually super important, and they may contain some pretty surprising things, more than you may realize. If you can get a camera trap, you can actually get some for quite cheap. It's can be quite fun to put one out in the forest in your neighborhood and see what's living there. You can get some for like $20. So I would definitely encourage that. But beyond that, just thank you, Georgia. Thank you, Christian, for having me on. This was really fun.
Yeah, definitely. My parents actually have a camera trap. They move it around like every few days. They've been obsessed with it for years now. But a quick plug, I think maybe a plug, if you don't have a place where you can put a camera trap you don't have money for a camera trap, you used citizen science to help identify some of the species in these pictures, right? Is that still a project that people can contribute to or ongoing or no?
You might be able to see some of the images online still. It's called Mesoniche, and it's called Michigan Zoom In. Mesoniche is a different project. It's called Michigan Zoom In, and it's on the Zooniverse platform, which is a platform that is used for public science a lot. And so you might be able to find our project. There are definitely other camera trap projects on there where you can look through wildlife imagery and you can find some real gems in there. And through that platform, you can help scientists classify some of these images. So we were actually able to identify from some of the survey. We had hundreds of thousands of images, and it was thanks to the public that we were able to actually get through all these images and get identifications in all of them. So the public is increasingly playing a role in science and can be involved, and it is much appreciated. So. But if you guys just want to go on there and just look at some pictures and just look through some wildlife, you're always welcome to do that as well. So
yeah, I'm adding a couple of links so that people can go. There's some computer smart AI intelligence that can be yes, computer says there's coyotes in these photos, but it's still not as good as people looking at the photos. So if you want, you can actually contribute to research like what Rumaan does through these online citizen science stuff. So I'll look up some more links and add them to the comments. But yeah, thank you so much, Rumaan, for coming on as a guest.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. So I certainly have learned a lot. So it's always
good. Yeah, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining in. It was a great discussion.
Yeah, appreciate the questions.